He was known as the Intimidator for a reason. The late Dale Earnhardt Sr. was more than just a driver. He won 76 races, won millions of dollars in prizes, and left his mark on the Daytona dirt. As a Southern motorsports royalty, he stood for bold control and unbreakable grit. All of that came to an end in one shocking moment on February 18, 2001. A crash in the last lap that looked like just another bump turned out to be the one that killed a star and shook NASCAR to its core. What happened next broke my heart. What really happened on the last lap at Daytona? He had been here before. The crowd roars the same way every time, same tight turns at very fast speeds. For Dale Earnhardt, Daytona was his church. He knew every part of it, including the long straights and steep hills. He had won it, bled on it, and put medals above the finish line. However, he wasn't in first place in the race that February afternoon. He was busy with something just as important. He was watching out for it. On the very last lap of the 2001 Daytona 500, Dale Earnhardt Sr. was keeping the pack back. There was a fight for the win between his son Dale Earnhardt Jr. and his driver Michael Waltrip. Behind them, Dale Sr. was stopping, sliding, and protecting the inside line with his car like a bodyguard. It was a planned and thought-out move. He was no longer just racing for himself. He was captain of his team in a fast-paced game of chess, where one mistake could mean disaster. Then it took place. Sterling Marlin's car got into Earnhardt's rear quarter panel as they went into turn 4, with the finish flag just around the corner. It was not rough. It was the kind of impact that goes on a lot during races, but at 150 miles per hour, even a small push can kill. Earnhardt's car went down a little, then snapped up and against the wall. Ken Schrader's car pulled up next to him. When the two cars hit each other, Dale's number 3 Chevrolet hit the outside barrier head-on. Things didn't look terrible. Not at first. The car ran into the wall and stopped. There was no fire, no exciting spin, and no parts going off. There was a crash. Not anything that would make fans in the stands gasp in shock, though. In fact, it looked like it could be survived. Dale had walked away from this kind of mess 100 times before, but this time was different. The first person to get in touch with him was Ken Schrader. He got out of the wrecked car he was in and ran to the driver's side of the third car. He quickly turned away after seeing what he did. His face changed. His posture got worse. He told reporters afterward that he wouldn't talk about what he saw. His reason wasn't to protect Dale, but because he knew he was about to die. The medical teams got there quickly. He was taken to Halifax Medical Center after being pulled from the wreckage. The world was ready. Fans didn't say anything. The pit workers stopped moving. Radio and TV hosts, who usually talk a lot when a race is over, spoke quietly. NASCAR had just changed in a way that would never go back. On May 16, at 5:16 p.m., doctors confirmed what many people already thought. Dale Earnhardt Sr. was killed quickly by the crash. The man who seemed impossible to beat and whose image was built on scariness and bravery was gone. However, how could a crash that looked so minor kill the most skilled driver on the track? That's what the autopsy would show, and what it showed shocked fans. The autopsy report from the Volusia County Medical Examiner showed that Earnhardt died from a bacillus fracture in the head. A serious break at the base of the head, usually near the brainstem, is what this kind of break looks like. This is one of the most dangerous types of head injuries, and it's usually caused by quick, rapid slowing down. That's what happened when Earnhardt's car hit the wall at high speed. Even though the crash only lasted seconds, the forces that were at work were huge. The break was called a ring fracture that went around the base of the head. When this kind of damage happens, the brain stops working right away. We can say that Dale Earnhardt died when his head violently snapped back after being thrown forward during the crash. It was quick, quiet, and over. It wasn't painful or aware, it was just sudden, unbreakable silence. The exam also showed that the person had been hit in the chest. Their lungs were broken, their left ankle was broken, and they had abrasions from the seatbelt. In the moments after the accident, reports quickly spread that the seatbelt had broken. Some people thought it might have been changed before the race. Others thought it had torn when it hit something. But medical staff and team members said those reports were not true. Tommy Probst, A rescue worker who tried to save Earnhardt's life said in public that the seatbelt was still in place when he got to the scene of the accident. No matter what, the outcome was the same. Just the blow to the head was enough to kill him. The lack of a device to support the head and neck, the Hans device, was very important. At the time, NASCAR did not require drivers to wear the device, and Earnhardt refused to do so because he thought it made it harder for him to move around. Other drivers agreed with him. That changed in an instant. A study within NASCAR began almost right away. Within days, the organization was looking at crash video, car parts, and talking to doctors to figure out how one of the sport's biggest stars had died in a crash that seemed like it could have been avoided. What they found was very bad. The cars were not flexible enough. The walls were too strong. It was time to replace the safety gear. It was a harsh wake-up for a sport that had spent decades focusing on speed and showmanship. One sad thing became clear when Earnhardt died: it had to get better. It did happen. Within the year, new safety rules were put in place. The Hans method had to be used. The inside of cars was changed to better absorb energy. Crash walls were remade with shields that were safer, panels made of steel and foam that absorbed kinetic force and lessened blunt contact injuries. The cockpits were made stronger, helmets got better, even the seats were changed to make them safer for the driver's head and back. Dale Earnhardt's death was more than just the end of an era, it was the start of a change. Even though he was gone, every driver who has survived a crash since then owes something to the memory he left behind, not only on the track, but also in a report that changed the rules. As word spread that he had died, honors came in from all over the world. At Daytona, fans cried out loud. People in the race wore black armbands. His famous number 3 car became a sign of respect and loss. No longer were there any worries about how tough he was or how committed he was. That's what the person who said he'd rather die in a race car than go away quietly did. In the process, he left a plan that could have saved hundreds of lives since then. But the people who were there that day, especially his son Dale Earnhardt Jr., were in a lot of pain. It was about them. In front of you, your father died at 200 miles per hour. You will never forget that. For Junior, the sadness turned into drive. He carried the Earnhardt name into a new age of racing. He won races, became the most famous driver every year, and fought for safer racing conditions along the way. There's something scary about how Dale Earnhardt died, not because it was exciting, but because it was calm. Out of the blue, almost impossible for the untrained eye to see. Don't smoke, not any fires. He was just a man who had been through everything the sport could throw at him. Undone by a single very strong event in fate and physics, and maybe that's why everyone remembers it so well, because anyone can have what happened to him. How one death changed an entire sport. When it was revealed that Dale Earnhardt Sr. had died, NASCAR's culture changed. It wasn't just sadness. It was time to count. The sport had been on a very fine line for decades, between being an exciting show and putting people's lives in danger. Accidents were going to happen. While crashes were fun, the death of the Intimidator was a different story. It wasn't just the death of a hero, it was a call to action. Within hours, NASCAR officials started a full probe within the company. Every shot of the race video was watched again. All of Earnhardt's number 3 Chevrolet's technical parts were looked at. Medical papers, car data, and even pieces of seatbelts were looked at closely. There were no rules. More and more people were realizing that something basic was wrong if Earnhardt could die in what looked like a mild crash. Something had to be fixed. What they found made them feel bad. The cars had changed over time to get faster, stronger, and better at cutting through air. They made it more likely that they would crash, though. The stiffness that let a car fly through the air also made it give the driver more force when it hit something. It felt like being inside a steel and plastic rocket. There were also the concrete walls that were everywhere and didn't give in. All of the force that a driver hit them was mirrored back into them. The Daytona track was made for speed, not for staying alive. Earnhardt hit the outside wall of Turn 4 at an angle that sent all of his kinetic energy straight into the cabin. That energy had nowhere to go, and it killed everyone. The answer came right away. NASCAR set up the Research and Development Center, a building whose only goal was to make drivers safer. Biomechanical engineers, wound doctors and crash experts were brought in to help them. Injuries in racing could no longer be seen as just a bad side effect. Prevention had to become very important. The first big step forward was in restraint methods. After a few months, the Hans gadget was no longer a possibility. This head and neck support system held the driver's helmet in place on the shoulders, which stopped Earnhardt from getting the fatal shock that broke his brain. The very action that killed him would now be physically impossible for drivers who wear the device in the future. After that came the safer wall. Instead of plain concrete walls, the steel and foam energy reduction system used stacked materials that took in and spread out energy. These barriers, which were made by engineers at the University of Nebraska, worked like shock cushions and cut crash forces by as much as 70%. They were first put up at Indianapolis, and then they quickly spread to all of NASCAR's big tracks. The cars themselves went through big changes. When it came out in 2007, the car of the future had a bigger frame, a stronger roof, and materials in the cabin that would absorb impact. The car was moved farther away from the door to lower the risk of injury from a side accident. The roof flaps were changed. The roll bars were made better. Every part of the car was rethought with one question in mind: how can we make sure that the next Dale Earnhardt doesn't die? People had a range of reactions. Fans of the sport for a long time were afraid that it would become too controlled, too clean and too slow. Some people even said that NASCAR was using Earnhardt's death to get away with marketing redesigns. But most people knew what was at stake. It couldn't have been for nothing that one of the best drivers of all time died. The sport should have learned something from Dale Earnhardt's death. Some drivers didn't want to make the changes at first, but they did. A lot of people didn't want the Hans gadget because they said it was uncomfortable or limiting. But pushback went away when people saw what happened that February afternoon. Everyone didn't want to be the next autopsy report. Engineers, crew chiefs and even pit workers started to train in new ways. It became normal to do safety drills. Simulations of crashes were looked at in great depth. It was no longer possible to fly by feeling. He was now king of data. Earnhardt was everywhere, even though he wasn't there. His face stayed on the goods. His name was used to honor him. His third number became holy. But more than that, his death set the standard for all decisions made after that about safety. Every new hat, changed rule, and lowered barrier carried a piece of his heritage. Something very strange happened in the years that followed. The number of deaths in NASCAR dropped to 0. Since that day in 2001, no driver has died in a big NASCAR event. There have been terrible crashes, flips through the air, and cars that burned to the ground after splitting in half, but the drivers were still alive, if hurt or scared. And every time, someone brings up Dale. Fans still don't start with the rules book when they talk about the safety of NASCAR today. They only have one name to begin with. One number. One accident on the last lap of the Daytona 500, because NASCAR woke up that day. It never went back to sleep after that. What they found inside the car, according to the autopsy report. A lot of people saw the crash, but the truth about what happened to Dale Earnhardt Sr. was locked up in the ruins, inside his body, and inside the quiet of the first people to arrive on the scene. People have been asking for weeks for answers, not stories or guesses, but real facts. They were found guilty by autopsy. That being said, those solutions were not just medical, they were terrible. The autopsy was done at the Volusia County Medical Examiner's office, which is not far from Daytona. What they found was clear and quick. Dale Earnhardt died right away from a deadly bacillus skull fracture, which is a horrible accident that almost no one makes it through alive. The story didn't talk about a freak accident. It was a perfect mix of mechanical science and how weak people are. He got the ring fracture at the base of his skull when his head suddenly snapped forward and then backward after hitting the wall. There was no seat or cap that might be able to stop that without a head collar, and Earnhardt didn't have one on. But the head wasn't the only wound. The autopsy showed that the 5-point harness caused serious chest injuries, broken ribs, a fractured sternum, and a fractured left ankle. A lot of attention was paid to the seatbelt itself. Some people thought it was cut. Some said it broke when it hit something. There looked like a tear in the photos. There were a lot of crazy ideas. A NASCAR probe was started to check the condition of the belt. They talked to safety experts, looked at manufacturing specs, and looked at crashes that happened before. Tommy Probst stood by what he saw when he tried to revive Dale on the track. The belt was tight. Some, though, people on the Richard Childress race team said the belt had been cut all the way through. It was a secret that made the pain worse. It was even called into question where Earnhardt's seat was placed. Some people thought it was fixed too low, or leaned back too far. Was it a choice for ease, a desire for exposure, or a mistake that made it more likely that someone would die? The study didn't find a clear answer, but it did bring up an uncomfortable truth. Details of the smallest kind can mean the difference between life and death. Fans had been wondering about something, and the autopsy gave them an answer. Did he go through pain? No, was the answer. It's likely that Dale Earnhardt wasn't aware when his brain broke. Death came right after. There was no pain or fight, there was only quiet. That could have made things worse. Because the man who had been in fires, cars that had flipped over, and broken bones, and who had seen death more than once, was taken in an instant by something that couldn't be seen. Flames, sparks from impacts, or any other sign gave them away. It was just a twitch of bad physics at the wrong time. You would be wrong, though, to think that the study closed the case for NASCAR. It made things worse. It let doors open. It called for change. It also started a quiet war in the sport. History and life are at war. It wasn't about how Dale Earnhardt died anymore. It was how many more people would die if nothing was done. The effects of the autopsy report were felt right away. NASCAR was already in shock from the public's sadness. It had to face a hard truth now, though. The old ways of doing things and thinking. It was no longer enough. Race safety could no longer be reactive. It had to take the lead. To do that, they had to do more than tweak cars. The culture had to change. Many drivers had been against safety improvements for years. Some people in the field made fun of the Hans gadget, which came out in the 1990s. Drivers thought it made it harder for them to turn their heads. Some people said it made them feel suffocated in the cockpit. Dale Earnhardt was one of the sharpest foes of it. He thought that racing was supposed to be scary and that new safety features shouldn't hurt speed or freedom. That assumption was broken as soon as the results of the autopsy were made public. Within a few weeks, the Hans device was worn by the best drivers at every race. Within a year, it had to be done. This change can be easily linked to the spot where Dale Earnhardt's black Noma 3 car hit the wall and to the cold clinical conclusions of the medical report that came after. A 300-page report called the Earnhardt Report was also released by NASCAR. It is a thorough probe that includes crash data, forensic analysis, seatbelt tests, and high-speed video from every angle. It proved that the forces involved in the crash were well below what would have been needed to survive without the right safety gear. The broken head could have been avoided. Everyone was shocked when they realized that. Because if Dale Earnhardt could die in a crash that looked so normal, then no one was safe. Every driver on the grid saw themselves in that seat all of a sudden. Every team owner began to wonder if their cars would be the next big thing in the news across the country. Based on the study, NASCAR came up with the car of tomorrow, a better, more stable, and less likely to crash design that they used starting in 2007. But changes were happening even before that. Crash data recorders, new rules about how harnesses should be worn and kept, seat mounting angles, and most importantly, the building of better barriers at all tracks. But even as the business changed, the plot ideas wouldn't go away. Some fans said that the autopsy report had been changed. Many people thought that NASCAR had lied about some things to avoid being sued. Some people even said Earnhardt might have been more likely to get hurt because he had hurt his neck before the race. There was never any proof for any of these claims, but they showed how deeply the loss affected them emotionally. They didn't just want to end things, they wanted to know what happened. And sometimes it felt too easy and cruel to say that a helmet wasn't enough or a strap tore. Since then, the body has been looked at many times more. The public talks about it again on every occasion, big crash and close call. Medical workers have said nice things about how openly NASCAR talked about the results. Safety experts still use Earnhardt's crash to teach others, and many drivers today say that it saved their lives. Something scary was shown on Dale's car's black box info. He didn't have time to answer. The wheel on his car hardly moved. He never put his feet on the brake. It was over before he even knew what was going on. That may be why so many people are still scared of it. Even though Dale Earnhardt was very skilled, had a lot of experience, and was known as the Intimidator, physics could still hurt him. He was human and would die, and the crash didn't care about what he left behind. But the world did, and what happened next turned one last effect into lessons that will last a lifetime. The shock started to wear off, but the truth stayed the same. NASCAR had to earn back the trust of both drivers and fans. Transparency became very important. After major accidents, the governing body started to release more information, which explained the mechanical forces at play and the safety steps that helped drivers stay alive. These changes weren't meant to get more attention, they were meant to teach. Dale's death also caused other racing races around the world to talk to each other. Before Formula One, IndyCar, and even the World Endurance Championship didn't share safety information with NASCAR as freely as they do now. No matter what the badge on the front of the car says, what killed Dale Earnhardt could kill anyone. So racing started to move forward as a whole, not as a bunch of separate countries. The mental health of drivers was one part of the autopsy scandal that wasn't given enough attention. Drivers had been taught for years to hide their fear and act like they could do anything, to never be weak. The field did change after Earnhardt's death, though, over time, drivers opened up more about the risks they were taking, their fears of leaving their families behind, and the pressure they felt to keep racing after seeing terrible things happen. Teams could get help from counselors. The Earnhardt family and others who were touched by the event got help with their grief. NASCAR has always been a sport for families. The mental cost of what the sport asked its players to go through was now being taken into account. Then there were the fans. Dale Earnhardt was more than just a driver to a lot of people. He stood for toughness, pride, and a strong will to succeed. It was like losing a friend you had never met when he died. That kind of loss didn't go away right away. It did change, though. Fans started to do something about their sadness. Safety papers were sent around. Online communities were full of detailed conversations about how to stop deaths from happening in the future. Safety was talked about in public for what seems like the first time in NASCAR history. A sign was made out of the black number 3 on a white background. It wasn't just a way to remember, it was about moving forward. And every time a driver walks away from a crash or a fan sees a wrecked car roll into the pits with the driver still alive, they remember that one man gave his life to make that possible. Even though Dale Earnhardt was buried, his story did not end there. It was the key point. It changed a sadness into something good. The history. When Dale Earnhardt died, it wasn't just the end of his story as a driver. It was the start of a reputation that would last much longer than his 76 wins and 7 titles. What happened on February 18, 2001, changed the way people thought about safety, how drivers were protected, and how the sport remembered its stars who had died. A lot of fans went to Daytona International Speedway in the days after the accident. Some people brought flowers, and others wrote letters by hand. A lot of people stood still at turn 4 and stared at the wall, which marked the end of a tale. It turned into holy ground, a shrine that was made on the spot with gifts from all over the country. While people were sad in public, a lot of what happened next happened behind closed doors. NASCAR was making the biggest changes to safety in its history, and every plan had Dale Earnhardt's name on it. His data from the crash test was used as a standard. His death was used as a case study. His seat in the car, his helmet, and even the angle of his neck when he hit the ground were all used as statistics in an effort to make sure it never happened again, and his family had to deal with the effects of that change. When Dale Earnhardt Jr. went back to racing, he wasn't just trying to win, he was also trying to leave a legacy. As the sport's next star, he earned respect not only for his skill but also for how he passed on his father's legacy. For 15 years in a row, fans chose him as NASCAR's most famous driver. His name lived on as he won races, built his own team, and carried on Earnhardt's work without ever trying to replace what had been lost. Then there was Teresa Earnhardt, Dale's wife, who ran Dale Earnhardt Inc. through both good times and bad. Some people praised her for keeping the company safe, others didn't like the choices she made. But there was no question that she had helped Earnhardt build his kingdom. The third number hasn't been used for more than 10 years. It wasn't changed. No one asked them to. People stopped touching it, but it wasn't officially banned. Instead, it was seen as a number that only belonged to one guy. It was with Austin Dillon, who is the grandson of Richard Childress, when it finally came back to the track. Even back then, Dale Jr. gave his approval. But more than honors and numbers, the real impact was the number of lives saved. In Earnhardt's time, drivers got away with accidents that would have killed them. One example is the scary accident that Ryan Newman had at Daytona in 2008. Even though his car flipped, hit the wall and caught fire, he lived. Since 2001, everything had been changed. The barrier gave way, the seatbelt, the helmet, and the hands device. However, the car took the hit. Dale Earnhardt's death changed the rules for how to stay alive in NASCAR. Not just in NASCAR, IndyCar was affected by the wave. Rally racing and Formula One. Around the world, automakers started to look again at safety in the cabin, crumple zones, and driving restraints. What began as a tragedy turned out to be a turning point. Since Dale, no other NASCAR Cup Series driver has died on the track. That is what he left us. Being the fastest man on the track was never the point. Being the man who changed the system for good was the point. Dale Earnhardt kept other people alive even after he died. And don't think the story stops with more safety measures and quiet monuments. Because fans still wear black number 3 caps to every race, and kids still watch races with their dads and talk about the last lap, Dale Earnhardt is still alive. He can still hear the engines roar and smell the rubber on the road. He can still remember every time a car spins out and the driver walks away safely. It's not in stone what he left behind. It's written in survival. What Dale Earnhardt left behind was more than just the track, the fans, and the rules. It got into how the sport taught history. Younger drivers who never drove with Earnhardt studied that last lap by watching clips, reading stories, and studying the stories. His appearance was a big part of teaching people how to drive. There was more to Earnhardt than just racing. His coaches talked about him as a reason why everyone had to wear a head harness, why the walls had to bend, and why survival was no longer up to chance. After that came documentaries. Biographies were made public. In honor races, memorial paint schemes showed up. In his hometown of Kannapolis, North Carolina, statues were unveiled. Even drivers from different teams would tip their hats to the number 3 whenever they went by the spot on turn 4 where the final crash happened. The Daytona 500 is no longer the only race that goes around that bend in the track. It marks the start of a new phase, a before and after. Even the toughest rivals admitted in interviews years later that Dale's death had changed them. Tony Stewart, Jeff Gordon, and Jimmy Johnson all said that Earnhardt changed the way they thought about racing and being responsible. They saw how thin the line was between speed and disaster when he died. Not only did they teach new players how to win, but also how to stay alive. Sponsors also saw. It became part of promotion to be safe. Car companies teamed up with new crash safety technologies. Tech companies worked with race teams to make better helmets, smarter harnesses, and biometric monitors that can read your body in real time. It was like the whole world of racing moved forward after one man learned his last lesson. It was even possible for Dale Earnhardt to have an impact on pop culture. His name and memory are talked about in movies, country songs, and even computer games. He did more than just race. He became a famous figure in America. Someone who stood for both toughness and sacrifice. Even now, when NASCAR's biggest races happen, like at Daytona, Talladega, or Darlington,